Hey everybody, sounds like the mic's working, that's good. It is great to be here, sort of following all of these really great talks, and hopefully we will live up to that, that tall order from Professor Ridd here. So my name is Ben Reed. I am the director of Mandiant's cyber espionage analysis team.
And my name is Gabby Roncone. I'm a technical analyst on Ben's team at Mandiant.
And we are talking today about UNC1151 and the Ghostwriter operation. But first, I wanted to give some acknowledgements. We obviously are both on the cyber espionage side. A lot of the work here is from Mandiant's information operations team. We've got a couple of them here today. Sam Riddell over there, and then Alice Ravelli, David Maynor, Alden Wallstrom also did a ton of work on this. Lee Foster, who is no longer with our company, but worked a ton on this when he was with us as well, is here as well. So we're going to talk about I/O, and just want to make clear that we're standing on their shoulders. So we're lucky enough to present up here, but a lot of the great work was also done by the Mandiant research team. They're sort of invaluable partners of our analysis side here, and there's also external partners who know who they are, who've really contributed to this. And so InfoSec is a team sport, and this presentation was the work of a lot of people. So if anything's wrong, blame me, but if it's good, give them the credit. So we're going to go through kind of some background: who is Ghostwriter, UNC1151, how do we track them, what do we think of them, and then get into the attribution, and then sort of a little bit in significance takeaway stuff.
All right, so first we're going to get into understanding Ghostwriter and UNC1151. I'm a big Scooby-Doo fan, so you'll see a lot of these throughout our talk. What is Ghostwriter? We all know of the Ghostwriter profession, but what we are talking about is the cyber-enabled I/O campaign with operations targeting audiences in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Ukraine. These operations push primarily anti-NATO themed narratives, and there are several different components of Ghostwriter operations that we track. Ghostwriter operations start out with falsified articles. And these are often posted on compromised news websites. So if you are one of those people who sits in the morning with your coffee or your tea and you're reading through your local news website on your phone, you might not notice that one of those articles that you're reading isn't supposed to be there. And that's really the point. They want to make sure that their falsified articles look legitimate, and so they will post them on compromised news websites to legitimize them in that way. They also send these narratives through direct email dissemination to media entities, press outlets at various organizations, sometimes just individuals that they think are interesting. And these emails contain sort of snippets of those narratives, links to the falsified articles themselves on those compromised news websites sometimes, or potentially a link to a blog. In order to sort of have a secondary source for their falsified articles, they will either repost some of the narrative content or rewrite it slightly, basically plagiarizing themselves on a blog that they hope to look legitimate, and sometimes they'll even cite these blogs in their initial falsified article. They'll also use personas, some of whom are inauthentic and some of whom are impersonating legitimate journalists or academics or just real people to legitimize the articles as well, and they will post them on social media. These Ghostwriter operations have a primarily anti-NATO focus, and here's a really good example of a document that was used in one operation that said, basically, hey, Lithuania, we see that COVID is spreading in your country, so NATO is just going to withdraw its troops. I hope that's okay. And it's a pretty good-looking document. It's not too shabby. But these are really the majority of the kinds of narratives that we see between 2016 and mid-2020. You can see here on our little graphic, we have a key in case you don't know your flags, but if you don't know your flags, you should learn your flags. Sorry. And these are primarily targeting audiences in Lithuania, sometimes these narratives foray into domestic political interference, so trying to make the current government of Lithuania look bad in some way, but primarily anti-NATO. And the anti-NATO narratives that we've seen sort of range from disparaging the character of NATO allies to talking about nuclear weapons or radioactive spills in Lithuania. A couple of the sort of classic narratives that disparage the NATO allies are, one of them is like related to carjacking. I don't know why they think that carjacking is the moral crux that we all have to live by. But they like to say that US troops, for example, are carjacking in Lithuania. We shouldn't have them here anymore, et cetera. So that is sort of primarily what we see. But then I have to go into who UNC1151 is. And UNC1151 is an intrusion group that we have tracked since 2017. They do cyber espionage operations, but they also have some ghost-like features. They also support Ghostwriter information operations. I'll get into the cyber espionage part first, but one thing I just want to note before I go into this graphic is that UNC1151 primarily uses GoFish infrastructure to send all of their emails, regardless of whether they are espionage related or the direct email dissemination for Ghostwriter operations. So primarily what we see UNC1151 doing is sending phishing emails with malicious links. And these lead victims to credential harvesting websites. This is the bulk of their operations for sure, but occasionally we'll see as well phishing emails with attachments with malicious documents that lead to malware, primarily .NET malware. And sometimes we see malware being used opportunistically. So in one case, we actually saw when there was a lot of panic in Ukraine about COVID-19 in the country, the UNC1151 group clearly took advantage of that panic and sent out a phishing email with a malicious attachment that would drop .NET malware that we call half shell that claimed to have information about the pandemic at that time. Primarily, these malware operations are targeting Ukraine and and Poland as well. And then you have UNC1151 sending benign emails that just have IO narratives for dissemination. The targets of UNC1151 between 2017 and 2020, specifically mid-2020, range kind of greatly. Most often we see Lithuania, Ukraine, and Poland being targeted, and industries such as government, military, media, nonprofits, and political organizations. But sometimes there are some outliers. We've seen Colombia be targeted, Kuwait being targeted, and we are not really quite sure what to make of those. The last thing that UNC1151 does, that's kind of a weird thing that I just want to say briefly, is they like sending bomb threats. So these one-off sort of IO operations that don't connect to Ghostwriter that are really inflammatory and scary, but we're not sure why they do that. And in summary, UNC1151 is an intrusion group that provides operational support to Ghostwriter operations.
So, this popped up. It's obviously espionage targeting in Eastern Europe. There's information operations, and sort of very familiar with some Russia stuff, and I'll get into sort of our sort of more nuanced views on that. But we think that this activity does have some links to Belarus, and that's kind of why we're up here trying to make this point. And it is a little bit unusual, and I'm going to try to take folks through how we arrived at this conclusion. So these links started to crystallize for us starting really the summer of 2020, sort of the activity there. And August 2020 is an important date in Belarus because that was when their most recent elections were, and these were heavily disputed elections. There was Lukashenko has been the president since 1994. This is probably the most serious challenge he had. Opposition, sort of outside observers estimate that the opposition candidate may have won. However, Lukashenko the government reported out that he got 80% of the vote. there were any number of people that were not thrilled about this, both within Lithuania and various other places. And so there were protests, and then you have a spiral of crackdowns, and then you have sort of a diplomatic problems here. And so that is, you have countries condemning it, sort of started sanctions. This gets to where Belarus is diverting a plane to arrest somebody who's flying over their airspace, more sanctions. And under that period of stress, both internally and externally, we saw a shift in the information operations. Whereas with the sort of, up until that time, you see it's almost entirely NATO related. But after that, you see a lot more, and I know, sorry, it's hard to read for folks here in the room. I think on top is sort of, you see an increase in domestic political interference. And so this is stuff where they're saying that essentially the ruling parties, primarily of Poland and Lithuania, there's corruption, they're having problems. And on the bottom, you see sort of specific criticism of these countries' policies towards Belarus. So you have these information operations narratives. I mean, they still, say bad stuff about NATO occasionally, but these information operations narratives become increasingly focused on Belarus-specific narratives. And so these are some examples of that. So you've got the tweet here by what we think is likely an actor-controlled account. It sort of got taken down fairly quickly, so our team wasn't able to make a final determination, but talking that Poland's spending too much money supporting the Belarusian extremists and not enough money on sort of healthcare in Poland, which I don't think those are really comparable budget line items for the Polish government, but that was the narrative. And you've got examples here of stuff published in August of 2020, so right after, things that sort of people protesting against the Belarusian elections in Lithuania, they're going to get COVID, they shouldn't protest. That sort of trying to mess up relations between Poland and Lithuania, which both in the NATO context and the EU context is a really crucial diplomatic hub, because they are the neighbors of Belarus. That this is going to lead, that sort of supporting the opposition is going to lead to Russian military intervention. So a lot of narratives sort of specifically around the Belarusian elections and what folks should do about it. The narratives have also paralleled and sometimes intermingled with the other provocative actions taken by Belarus. Obviously, this talk has been in the works for a while. Obviously, the crisis on the Belarus-Poland border with migrants is awful and has crested, but this sort of the screenshot here of a compromised Polish sort of municipal website, so still very much in the pattern of what they've done before, the same TTPs, but this one is about a priest that was allegedly murdered by a sort of, I think, an Iraqi national, they said, who was a migrant. Not just a migrant, but a migrant that had gone into Lithuania and then traveled from there in Poland. So you have anti-migrant stoking, you have kind of relationship between the two countries. The media called the priest, he is alive. It was pretty quickly debunked. So these are not always sort of like long-term successes, but you're also seeing sort of Poland and Lithuania urge sort of NATO to send troops into Belarus. You have kind of different narratives here, sort of both playing up the problems that these governments are causing with their anti-Belarus things, and also sort of, in some cases, sort of putting extreme versions of the threat out there. And we think, another thing we've noticed with this is that these information operations we don't think are necessarily just to impact the public in Poland or in Lithuania, but we see them being funneled back into Belarus. So there have been a couple of Ghostwriter misinformation, sort of false stories, that have been reported as fact on Belarusian TV. And I can't speak to the sort of journalistic standards of Belarusian state television, so it's possible they're just grabbing anything that looks friendly. But we've seen sort of those narratives posted there. We've also seen there's sort of a extensive campaign of leaking allegedly private documents out of the Polish government. We've seen that heavily featured on Belarusian state TV, that you've got screenshots of here. And we've also seen a couple of content from Ghostwriter-associated Telegram channels reposted into pro-Belarus, sort of pro-Lukashenko nationalist Belarusian Telegram channels. And we don't have the information to say that these pro-Lukashenko Telegram channels are owned by them. It may just be sort of, again, sharing friendly news. But there is some indication that these narratives are used to influence with really kind of a boomerang effect, where you get, okay, there's this thing in a Polish paper talking about how Poland's so bad. So for the Belarusian public, you may think that your government may not be great, but these people who are trying to undermine us are worse. So in addition to sort of the information operations shift, the targeting sort of in the 2020, 2021 timeframe shifted as well. It's become more sort of a little bit parochial, a little focused on neighboring countries, where we saw, as Gabby mentioned, the wider spread earlier. These are just some examples of some phishing, or spoofing domains that we reported on, I think, a few months ago. So you've got some Microsoft stuff, some Yahoo stuff, some things that are used pretty widely, but then you've also got sort of local Polish webmail providers, the Polish parliament, things like that. And sort of most interestingly, there's been a lot of targeting that's very specific to Belarus in terms of the opposition, in terms of journalists. This targeting really starts in the spring of 2020, in the lead up to the election. In some cases, folks who we were able to identify having been targeted were later arrested or detained by the state. So these are people that are definitely of interest to the state, and kind of builds the profile that this is happening for the benefit of the Belarusian regime. So this is the annoying part. So in addition to this, we have some technical indicators that some of these operators are likely based out of Minsk, and some may have ties to the Belarusian military. I understand, this is very much a PCAP or it didn't happen kind of conference, and I don't have that to share right now due to the sort of the sensitivity of the stuff, some of the partners. So I am sorry to come to you with that. I know it's frustrating. And I'm not putting this up here because I'm trustworthy and I want you to believe me. I'm putting this up here because this is going to factor into the assessment that we're going to get into next. And I want to explain where that came from. Everybody is welcome to take the public stuff and come to your own assessments, do your own research on that. We're happy. I'm looking forward to hopefully more discussion of these potential links coming out of this, but just kind of wanted to say that we have seen this. It's been sort of directly reviewed. We have sort of looked at corroborated stuff with second and third sources. There's stuff that has matched up, and we think it's strong, but I'm not able to get into details. So apologies for that.
So not much is known publicly about Belarusian cyber capabilities, and so we did a deep dive to see where they showed up in policy and where they showed up in practice. And in 2014, there was actually a video that was released publicly on Belarusian state TV that confirms that the Belarusian military has a defensive cyber capability. Now, the theme here, what you'll see in the policy examples that we pull out, is that many of these examples are purely defensive or could be purely defensive. In 2016, again, the Belarusian security doctrine includes the concept of hybrid war. Now, we see Belarus doing hybrid war right now by weaponizing migrants on their border with Lithuania and now in Poland. But when they did declare this security doctrine in 2016, they made note that they were going to learn from their neighbors in Ukraine. And as we know, Ukraine has experienced several different cyber operations prior to 2016 and since 2016, and thus one can assume that Belarus is probably taking note of those and may seek to develop capabilities themselves to prevent things like that happening in Belarus. In 2019, their information security concept mentions that Belarus will defend its interests using all available forces and means, and in 2021, there's actually a call to update their national security concept to account for NATO cyber capabilities. So this is something that Belarus is clearly aware of and they're thinking about, but again, framed very defensively here. Is it possible that they could have cyber capabilities in practice, though? And one thing about Belarus is that they have a flourishing IT sector. And so given that, they could probably draw from a pretty experienced pool of talent. And there's infrastructure in place there potentially to outsource capabilities should they need to do that. And in 2018, the Belarusian military announced the creation of an IT company to help develop military capabilities. So there's definitely some of the groundwork there that's out publicly, and it is definitely plausible that these exist.
So now to get into sort of specifics of what were sort of our analytic line, and it is a little bit nuanced because what would an analyst if you give people space, they're going to come up with very specific assessments. But so what we're saying is UNC1151, the intrusion set, is linked to Belarus with high confidence. So that is linked. That is because you have the specific targeting of Belarusian interests. You have the links to the Ghostwriter campaign, which is also sort of very parochial for Belarus. And we have sort of the technical indications. And the ties to the military, things like that. It also matches up with their targeting. They tend to be sort of more focused on ministries of defense or militaries, both abroad and sort of the French targeting was the French military is spoofing domain there. So it all seems to align there. The Ghostwriter is tied to Belarus with moderate confidence. And you have a lot of the similar sort of softer alignments, but and obviously the ties to 1151, the technical support that you're getting from this group that we have tied with high confidence, but there are some questions there with the content generation. And I do also want to sort of get into a little bit of the questions that are still out there. So we think it's very likely that Belarus is involved. There are other countries, and we'll get to Russia specifically, that are also plausibly involved as well. So this is the things we don't know as much about. So the IO content has sort of been, they've used 7 different languages. A lot of it's been in neighboring countries. It's obviously there are a lot of people in Belarus. I'm sure people speak German and Lithuanian and Russian there. But it's a different skill set than running an intrusion campaign. So we don't want to bleed over too much of having the intrusion campaign linked. Very plausible it's the same unit, but it's just something we don't know. The other one is the source of their malware. They have sort of, interestingly, sort of used almost all custom malware that we haven't seen used by any other groups. So again, as Gabby mentioned, they have a IT sector. Sort of malware is just software that you don't want on your computer. It's not, they certainly have the capability. It's .NET malware. It's not sort of a zero-day rootkit or whatever. But it is something that it's possible they're outsourcing, possible they're getting from somewhere else, and we just don't know there. And the third is there are a few operations in pre-2020 that we don't have kind of an ironclad reason for. There are sort of Colombia, Ireland, Kuwait. There are plausible explanations for this. There may be bilateral sort of stuff that we don't know about. There may be testing. It may be sort of people caught in the crossfire. There are a couple of things that looked like they were sent to a diplomatic list that had multiple embassies. But it is a question out there. And the big question that leads into is, what is the role, if any, of Russia here? And is this a joint operation, things like that? And so where we are is we can't rule out Russian involvement, especially given the close political union, the literal political union between Belarus and Russia. Obviously, Russia has a long history of doing intrusion operations and information operations in Eastern Europe. However, the one thing sort of to consider is that these are, at least post-2020, are politically sensitive operations. They are sort of dealing with Belarus's bilateral relations. And there is some friction between Belarus and Russia. So we don't know exactly what this is, but one thing to note here is we don't see any overlaps between the 1151 or the Ghostwriter activity and other cyber espionage or information operations that have been publicly attributed to Russia. Whether that's, we've seen Sandworm and sort of Temp Armageddon, Gameradon active in Ukraine at the same time as 1151, but they've been distinct operations that operate distinctively. Even sort of their credential theft operations look differently. And similarly with IO, sort of, there is the secondary infection campaign, but that is distinct from the Ghostwriter campaign. So it is its own thing, and we think it should be operated as, sort of evaluated as such. And again, like I said, there are a number of good reasons to suspect Russian involvement. We just don't have the hard evidence there. Again, plausible, but I certainly can't disprove it. So, significance and takeaways. I got 1 minute, and then we will have time for some questions, but sort of 3 main points here that I wrote down so I don't forget. And certainly ours isn't the only presentation to emphasize this, but these types of intrusion and information operations campaigns are accessible. It is not just Russia and China that can do this. That's going to be, obviously Iran has done it. It's going to be driven home later. That we think that this is accessible to a broader range of folks, and we're seeing that now. The second is that cyber is a tool that is sort of, intrusions are useful for gathering information, but a pivot to information operations is fairly straightforward, and it's something that, again, we'll see. I think there are presentations later today about, but it's something I think we can expect to see more of. And the final thing is that these are just tools for the government. They use it to accomplish their goals, and if the leader says, hey, we need to do this, people are going to use all the tools available to them. So cyber operations don't exist in a vacuum. It is happening alongside the migrant crisis, alongside Belarus threatening to cut off gas supplies to Europe. So it is important to remember the geopolitical side of things, not just the sort of the bits and bytes. So thanks, folks. Yeah, and it looks like we do have a little time for questions.
Hi, great talk. To go back to the bits and bytes, even though you said it's not as important, have you seen them sort of evolve there, whether it's direct tradecraft and the phishing operations or their malware capability develop and mature, or has it sort of stayed somewhat stagnant during your visibility?
So we have seen their malware operations mature somewhat over time. We found some early stuff that they did, and they uploaded to VirusTotal some weird lore documents that were pretty rudimentary, and they started off with a PowerShell-based backdoor that handled very basic commands, and they sort of evolved into putting together more, I guess, slightly more built-out .NET malware. But it wasn't, it was clear that from the first sort of instance of PowerShell malware that we saw, that they had an idea of what they were doing. They were familiar with at least PowerShell-based frameworks.
Excellent presentation. I just had a quick question on the degree to which you guys did compare. It sounds like you did some comparing and contrasting with known GRU TTPs. Did you do the same for FSB?
So we compared it against all of the Russia sets. So whether that's 29 or whether that's sort of the Armageddon or things like that. And yeah, these guys they're just a little bit different. I mean, some of the things there is overlap. They used freenom. Other people use freenom. There are kind of some of those things that do look similar, and certainly that when we first found the first cluster of phishing domains, it's like, oh, is this the next thing from whoever? But it's been a continuous operation since 2017. And so we have as a single cluster with no overlaps. So we haven't seen sort of any fits or starts or things like that.
In your slide on the appealing to a Belarus public, you had something that was in Russian, not in Belarusian language, but it used the word Belarusia, not Belarus, suggesting it was generated in Russia. As far as I know, even Russian-speaking Belarusians refer to themselves as Belarus.
That is above my. I took German. That is above my pay grade.
We both took German.
So happy to talk about this afterwards. These are the top left. Yeah, these are screenshots from. I think the top one is the Telegram channel.
Yeah, it's a Telegram channel.
So, yeah, I mean they're. Try not to read too much into sort of one specific word, but we've been able to link it to the broader operation through a bunch of different technical sides. I'm sure the IO folks here happy to talk about that.
Do we have any final question? If not, I just want to
everybody wants lunch.
Quickly hop up here and say thank you again to Ben, Gabby, but really also to John and to Mandiant for especially accepting this talk and making it going public with a controversial finding. I'll just remind you that there are governments, some of them were, in those flags, that have skin in the game in this attribution in this particular case. And I think it's a sign of a more mature conversation in our space that we can bring into the public domain a set of empirical findings and forensic artifacts, perhaps at some point, that just make for a better and more nuanced attribution conversation. So thank you for doing that.
All right, thanks, folks.
Thank you.